A couple of weeks ago, Keith Wood picked the best 15 that he played against. I'm delighted to say Matt Williams is going to pick the best 15 he coached against. Matt, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning, Joe. Very good, mate.
Keith Wood gave out to us for ruining his day when we pitched this at him. It looks like you've done a lot of work on this as well. And the players you've coached against, well, they're pretty good. Where did you start? What was your first team that you kind of took into account?
Well, the first thing was I'd never thought of this. It had never, ever crossed my mind. And when I got contacted by Colin, one of the producers, I went, wow, that's a great question. And I actually reached out to some of the guys I worked with over the years. And it took us a long time because there were just so many unbelievably good players. And then you come back and say, oh, we've forgotten so-and-so, we've forgotten so-and-so. And when we started to list it up, what I did was I listed out some of the players, not all of them, in the positions, and then who was the best and why. But wow, it is. I could put an argument for every 5 other players to be in those positions, and there was just such great quality around because I was really privileged to coach against some absolutely incredible teams across the decade. So yeah, it's a pretty decent list.
What was the earliest team that you coached against that made the list?
Well, I got to say, so I really. Like a good bush lawyer, I did say who you coached against. So I went right back to the first time I coached, and I started very young. I was only 33, coaching first grade in Sydney at my old club, Eastwood Rugby Club, and of course I coached against the great Randwick sides of that time that were basically Wallaby teams. You had Wallabies. This would be like young Munster or Lansdowne, being a Wallaby team, and in their second 15, there's 3 or 4 Wallabies as well. It's just off the scale, And that was David Campuzzi. I coached David with the Waratahs a few years later, but I coached against David at club level. But club rugby in Sydney in the 80s and 90s was the power base of the Wallabies that won World Cups. It was extraordinarily high standard. We look back on it now, with this great understanding, that's what drove it. There were Wallabies everywhere. There were great players that couldn't be Wallabies. The standard was just so high. Like they'd come out. The Sydney team didn't lose to an international team for 15 seasons. So every time a team would tour, including New Zealand, they would play a Sydney side, although they didn't play Sydney very often. But, they beat England, they beat Wales, beat Ireland. All of the great touring sides were beaten by that Sydney side. That's the height, that's the quality of the competition. At the time, it's deteriorated hugely since then, but that's what it was.
And so would Sydney pick the best players from the clubs, even if they were Wallabies? It was kind of like but you have to be playing for one of the Sydney clubs. Is that how that worked?
Yeah, you had to be. It was the best players in the Sydney competition, what we call a shoot shield.
Right.
And even though Australia might lose to them a couple of weeks later, the Sydney side beat them. But they had that tradition. They played at some beautiful little grounds that we'd fill up. And, they were great players. And that was powered again by the Sydney schools and the New South Wales schools as it was then. And, Mark Ella, the 3 Ella brothers, Campuzzi, that was a Randwick backline. I remember playing sevens against them and they scored this try. We were leading them. We came out as an under-20s team in this sevens comp. We played Randwick and we led them 7-0 at half-time. And they just scored these impossible tries. I remember Mark Ella walking back, just looking at me and goes, sorry, mate. And he meant it. He just took us apart. They were true. And Mark Ella's not on my list because I didn't coach against him or Mark had retired. He retired at 26. Mark's the best player I ever saw. I have ever seen.
Are you?
Mark retired at 25. So he won the Grand Slam with the Wallabies in 84. And in 86, when they beat New Zealand, the last team before Ireland did to beat New Zealand in New Zealand and won at Eden Park, Mark was commentating and he was 26 years old. And he never played in national rugby again, which is just a tragedy, absolute tragedy. Because the coach at the time was a guy called Alan Jones, who was a really highly controversial coach. People either loved him or hated him, and Mark wouldn't play for him after the 84 Grand Slam tour, and he never played for the Wallabies again.
I'm concerned, Matt, looking at your list here, that you're going to piss off a lot of seriously talented players, because the list of players you haven't picked is probably the most impressive that I've seen. Where do you want to start?
Oh, mate, we'll start. Let's be sensible, unlike how the Irish rugby teams announce their sides and start with number 1 and move to 15. Why we start at 15 and then change back to 1 after 8 is one of the great mysteries of Irish rugby. And then you come to 16, like, why not just start at 1 and go to 23? Isn't that the way everyone else in the world does it? So let's start with number 1. The great Oz Durant. Do you remember? So look, the best team, I could have easily picked the Auckland front row side of Dowd, Fitzpatrick and Ole Brown. That's the best front row I ever dealt with, and that was my first year that's when I first went into top line coaching in Super Rugby. I was assistant coach in '96 and then head coach in '97, and that Auckland side is the best side I've ever coached against. The best side I've ever seen pretty much anywhere, and they were a provincial side. But the best loose head I ever coached against was Oz Durant, the great South African loose head. He was a giant of a human being, a farmer from the high veld, huge man. And I first met Oz in '96, and he went on and won the World Cup in 2007, which was just an extraordinary piece of longevity for him. But I think what I've tried to do is these guys change the game. In their position, they was just so unique that the game had to move around their genius or their gifts. And Durant was just this unmovable object at the scrum that made any scrum he played in absolutely a weapon. And the size of the man's chest was just incomprehensible. And he also had this beautiful farmer's personality. He was a lovely man. He was an extrovert, or still is an extrovert. But everyone had to adapt their scrummaging because of the size of this guy and the way he went about his game. And he was an absolute revelation to the scrum. So what the Australians had to do, we had to work on a way to take the scrum down a significant amount towards the ground. So to take away their strength in the south of Australia, especially Oz Durant, the Wallabies and the Waratahs, all of us came up with this theory that if we could get them low enough, they can't use that strength on us. Now, there were huge risks in that, as far as you fall over and collapse and you give away penalties. In those days, there weren't as many penalties as bent arms. But you used the scrum. The scrum was your launch weapon to get the ball out. And that's what the South Africans didn't want. They wanted a scrummage and we wanted the ball liberated because we had great backlines. And so it changed the whole nature of scrummaging because of this one guy and the way the South Africans leveraged that.
You've Sean Fitzpatrick beside him. I think there's probably a generation who've grown up watching Sean Fitzpatrick on TV as opposed to watching him play rugby. So what was so special about him as a rugby player?
Well, Shawnee was he was the first, like, when I say cheeky, that's not the right word. He gave lip to everyone in the whole game, everywhere, for every second, and he matched it up with great skills, unbelievable competitiveness, a phenomenal leader, and was a personality, was an extrovert. You see Sean on TV, he's toned down from when he played. He was, and the New Zealanders had this persona as really dour, South Island farmers, and they were, they didn't smile. They were the most dour of the dour. And Sean wasn't. Sean was upbeat. They were electric. And that, he also led the modern New Zealand way of playing rugby, which was this extraordinary ball movement, great attack, great play from everyone, a 15-man game. New Zealand didn't play that. Up until that great Auckland side coached by Graham Henry, which Sean was captain of, New Zealand rugby was a very, very different beast, and that's why Australia could dominate. It was really very much an 8 to 9 man game or 10-man game with Grant Fox kicking, and Fitzpatrick led that revolution. Again, that's changed the game, changed the way hookers play. He was a forerunner of hookers like Woody, that were completely involved in the game, runners, not just there to throw it for a line out or a scrum.
How close was Woody, Matt?
Very close, very, very close. I probably would never hear the end of it if I told him he was the best hooker I ever coached against. So I probably had a bit of a sway on it. Some red wine might have been spilt over that. But look, Keith was a great player. John Schmidt. Who do and every one you could argue to put in. I think the other part was like I didn't coach against Keith much. It was only a few games where I coached against that great Auckland side twice a year. We'd go away at the beginning of the year for trials together, Canterbury, Queensland, Auckland and New South Wales. We'd go to up into Queensland and a thing called the South Pacific Cup, and we play each other as warm-up games for the Super Rugby. So we got to know these guys really well. We stayed in the same hotels, the same areas. You played games, and you were much more social after the games. There was interaction with the coaches, and so I got to know them very well, and I grew a great respect for them, and a great understanding of how brilliant of players they were. Not saying that Keith wasn't. Keith took Leinster apart on a number of occasions when I was assistant coach there back in 99, 2000. But Sean just gets the nod for me.
Is that Dowd, Fitzpatrick, Olo Brown, that Auckland team, is that kind of the birth of the Auckland Blues and everything that comes from them, that philosophy, that style of play? Like, in many ways, is it? I don't know enough about the history of New Zealand rugby, but it sounds like with Graham Henry's fingerprints there and those players, that it's kind of a foundational text in how we consider, say, the team that wins the World Cup with McCaw and Carter in London as kind of like, that's the high water mark where everything is absolutely perfect, the handling is perfect, they're kicking off both feet, everybody is so sublimely skilled, and that's the absolute peak of what rugby can be. Is the birth of that this team, is that kind of, am I overstretching a bit there, or is that it?
No, not at all. It's exactly right. And what happened was when we went professional after the World Cup in '95, Auckland, which you would see in the NBC, which blue and white stripes, they were still a magnificent side. They won the Ranfurly Shield many times. They were a phenomenal side right through that era. But they didn't play that style of play. They had Grant Fox as their out half. He was much more a kicking player. Still a wonderful player. Only a little man, 5'9", probably 82 kilos. Phenomenal footballer. But the metamorphosis of New Zealand rugby being based around 8 guys with a kicking game was this Auckland side under Henry, and these phenomenal players that they had through their side, like right through their side. Michael Jones, Jonah Lomu, we'll get to later on, Carlos Spencer, Ronnie Clark, Lee Stencil. I can name the side because it's Zinzan Brook, Robin Brook, Michael Jones. This was a side that contained, probably 7 or 8, maybe more all-time great players, and they revolutionised the way New Zealand played rugby. And they were just in an era of really good teams in Super Rugby that had won the World Cup. 87, 91 was Australia, 95 was South Africa, and 99 Australia. So the Southern Hemisphere was dominating, and all those teams were in Super Rugby. The Auckland team was head and shoulders above that for a number of years, and before Canterbury came through and started to challenge them because of the quality that Auckland put together and revolutionised the playing of rugby.
Okay, fair enough. Adam Jones is the final member of your front row. What was it about Adam Jones that makes him ahead of like a fairly star-studded list of threes?
Yeah, John Hayes, the best lifter in the line-out I've ever seen. Ewan McKenzie, phenomenal player all round. But, and Olo Brown, as I said, just an incredible footballer and also totally fit. I just think Jones was so outstanding. And the way that the team builds around a tight head prop, and that Wales side from that era that came to dominate for a considerable period of time around the 2005 mark, 2004 mark, when Mikey Ruddock won a Grand Slam with them. They built their team around him, and that sort of started this concept of you can build a team. If you get a quality tight head prop, you can build an organisation around that quality tight head prop. And what Adam Jones had, he wasn't just a scrummager. Like Oz Durant was a scrummager, pretty much full stop. He did other things, but certainly Adam Jones was a footballer, but he was also a supreme technician that went through on so many levels of the game. And really, you've got to say, a pretty average Welsh team for a period of time built a championship-winning side around his ability around the field and in the scrums. And that's a fair statement to say you can build a side around that one guy. And I believe that. I know that was Mikey Ruddock's thinking at the time.
You've got Paul O'Connell and John Eales as your second row partnership, which is, let's face it, world class, right? I think we have a fair idea of O'Connell. He's ahead of Mark Andrews and Martin Johnson for your number 4 jersey. Also a pretty star-studded list. So what swung it for O'Connell?
I have a lovely story about Paul that I told him once. It's my joke that Paul was injured when he was a very young player, and I was coaching Island A. We used to come in on a Wednesday, so Paul came in on the Wednesday. I think we were up in Belfast, and someone was got hurt in the big boys, and on the Thursday he was called into the senior team and played that weekend. And I say he's the best learner I've ever coached because I taught him everything he knows in one day. He was just, at that day at training, and I'll never forget it. Mark McCall was my assistant coach. Mark was gone on to win so many great trophies with Saracens. And that night at dinner with Bretty Igo, we're sitting there and we all just looked at each other and said, how good is Paul O'Connell? Like, just in one day, we said, that guy is just head and shoulders above everyone in this place. Like, how good is this guy? And you then saw what Paul went on to do with his career, his leadership, his attention to detail. Over multiple years, he was just an incredible second rower. Compared to even the greats like Martin Johnson and these other great players, Paul just had these gifts of leadership, but also of incredible skills. His aerial ability to be lifted and catch restarts, I think, is the best I've ever seen. I mean, there's probably some guys out Matfield. Like, how can you leave out Victor Matfield? And, another great Irish second rower, Malcolm O'Kelly, except for Paul, would be regarded as our best second rower along with Willie John McBride. But because Paul was so dominant, people forget how great Malcolm O'Kelly was. And Malcolm was staggering. Malcolm would be the best second rower I coached, but he doesn't make that lineup over Paul.
John Eel's obviously a totemic figure in Australian history.
Yeah, no, like a freak and a gentleman, 6'7", can hit a golf ball like a mile. Should have played for Australia at cricket. Could have played top line basketball. Just could do everything. His nickname is Nobody. What a great nickname, because nobody's perfect. And that's John. John is a gentleman off the field. You would not find a more lovely human being. He is a great ambassador, and he was head and shoulders away the best second rower I've seen in my life.
Your back row is also sensationally well balanced. You've got Olivier Magne, Michael Jones and Zinzan Brooke. The players who don't make it are Pienaar, Rocky Elsom, Richard Hill, Serge Betson, David Wilson, Sean O'Brien, Emmanuel Aronordicki, Delalio, Teichmann and Anthony Foley. So I think by virtue of the players we've listed off who don't make it, people can get a sense of the quality there. So Mann, Jones and Zinzan Brooke.
Yeah, Zinzan Brooke, Eden Park, 1996. I was assistant coach. We were at the Waratahs. We go toe-to-toe with them. It's like a phenomenal game. It's like 40-43, and we've played our absolute hearts out. There's about a minute and a half to go. Auckland are behind. They're ramming on our left-hand touch line near the try line, like a metre out. We give away a penalty. Zinzan Brooke picks the ball up, and in the most, like a John Elway gridiron pass, 65 metres, the full width of Eden Park, into the hands of Jonah Lomu, who touches down on the other side of the field unopposed. And you just look there and go, that's just not fair. That's just not fair. The guy could do everything. He dropped a field goal against the Springboks to win a game. The back row moves that are sadly gone from the game now, that should come back, hopefully will come back one day because they're so entertaining, was about him with a ball in hand. He's the most skillful number 8 I've ever seen. He is the prototype of the tall, athletic, highly skilled number 8s that we want in the game, and he was the best by a mile. Inside him, he had Michael Jones, the best 7 I've ever seen. Michael was just this incredible athlete with a motor, could do anything on the ball, off the ball, against guys like Simon Poitevin, who are great players, but Jones was head above. And Olivier Magne, is the best 6 I've ever seen, the great French player. Again, would catch the ball in the line out, would act as a second out half in attack. Brilliant defender, kicker. The great French comeback in the semi-final in 1999 against New Zealand, where they beat New Zealand. people forget that it was Mania at the core of that, creating the breaks, creating the opportunities that the French wingers capitalised on. But Mania was at the heart of the greatest upset in the history of World Cup rugby. And I coached against Olivier a number of times for Claremont, against Claremont, and also off the field, walked straight in the change room, shake hands, was beaten, heartbroken, just a champion on every front, as they all were, Sinzan Brooke and Michael Jones, just really wonderful ambassadors of the game off the field as well.
Scrum half, Matt, it can't have been easy either. You're looking at names here that didn't make it: Matt Dawson, Peter Stringer, Gary Armstrong, Brian Redpath, Fabien Galtier, George Gregan, but you've opted for a late great South African as your pick.
Yeah, just again changed the game. Who had 6'4" scrum halves? It didn't exist. They didn't have the guys of that size playing scrum half, just weren't in the game. And just the way he played, the physicality. And when I say physically, he wasn't a big man, but he was beautifully athletic. He was lightning quick, pass off both hands, kicking. But his threat as a runner was what revolutionised that play. Georgie Gregan was the other one that revolutionised because of his ability to take steps before passing, that we now see. If you look at Antoine Dupont, that is what makes Dupont a great player. But you imagine Dupont at 6'4", and that's what, or 6'2", which is what Just van Westhuizen was. And again, a phenomenal kicker of the game, unbelievable competitor, and drove South Africa to the 95 World Cup winning side. I coached against Just when he was with Northern Transvaal at Super Rugby, and again, just an absolute beast of a man to defend, because he would literally, his threat meant you had to have 3 defenders either side of the ruck, always there. So that's 6 players out of the defensive line just holding for Juice, because you could not let him run. If he ran, you'd lose. So you had to, that was your starting point. Okay, you 3 guys either side, lock in the ruck, make sure he doesn't get the gain line, and we all go forward and make him pass. But then he passes, and we're 6 defenders out of the game. He was an incredible man to tactically to try and nullify. And when you've got guys of that staggering talent, you can't. You can only try and minimise their impact on the game.
The list of out halves who don't make it: Michael Lynagh, Stephen Larkham, Joel Stransky, Johnny Wilkinson, Henry Honeywell, Roland O'Gara, Freddie Michalak and Andrew Mertens. So it must be someone bloody good, Matt. Who is it?
Mate, how could you leave those guys out? Carlos Spencer, and I guess it's also that Carlos Spencer, the combination that Carlos Spencer did, he was this gifted athlete. Like, the guy was like he was like the cover of Men's Health magazine. He had a 6-pack, he had shoulders. He was electric over 20 metres, like absolutely electric. And the only player I've seen with ball skills equal to him was Mark Ella. Mark Ella was better. That tells you how good Ella was. But Carlos Spencer used to do this play when I was coaching the Waratahs. He would catch the ball from his 9. He would pass to his 12. But he really didn't pass to the 12. You can't believe this. Because he would then recatch the pass that he was pretending to give to his 12. He would turn his body completely around and pop the ball from his right-hand side back inside his left-hand shoulder. So let me say that again. He catches, passes to no one, recatches, and puts the ball back behind his back to the left-hand side. At which point, Jonah Lomu would hit that ball at 110 miles an hour. It was the most indefensible play I have ever seen. And the first time I saw it, I was sitting with Al Gaffney, and we sort of were silent for a second. And then we both said, did he just pass, recatch, and throw it back over? And I remember our backline was defending. Manny Edmonds was at 10. And it's just indefensible. You just couldn't, because who do you stop? Who do you go to? And then the key, the attack weapon, is Lomu at full pace. He could just do things that I've never, apart from Mark Ella, I've never seen anyone do. And even Mark Ella, he had more pace over 100 than Mark. So he would quite often go 80, 90 metres and make breaks. Kick the ball both feet, spiral kicks like Ronan could. Probably never fulfilled his potential at the top level as winning a World Cup. but was the most awesome player I've ever seen.
I have to say, I remember watching him at the World Cup, and like there were between the legs passes, no look stuff. I feel a little bit like if he had won a World Cup, the game of rugby would have benefited massively, because people stuck it to him. Oh, you're all fancy Dan, you can do it when the big game isn't on the line. I'm like, that's not really what happened here. He did not cost him the World Cup. The rest of the team and the systems weren't in place. But if he'd won the World Cup, then every kid in the world would have been encouraged to try the nonsensical and to try and dream the dream that Carlos Spencer dreamed. And I actually felt like a mechanical form of rugby that was a bit soul-crushing, that was a bit South African, that was a bit England, took over as the dominant. Well, this is how you win a World Cup, because you get it done, you stick it up the jumper, and you, whatever you do, don't be a fancy Dan like Carlos Spencer.
Yeah, 100%, mate, 100%. And that was always the argument. If you watch again, the two greatest games of rugby I've ever seen involved France. The semi-final of the '87 World Cup where they beat Australia in Australia, and the '99 semi-final where they beat New Zealand at Twickenham. And I was fortunate to be at both games. But people forget, if you watch the first half of that France-New Zealand game, where New Zealand absolutely dominated and Lomu scored some great tries, it was Spencer that was creating all the space, Spencer that was creating all the havoc with Jonah Lomu and Tana Umaga. He was absolutely incredible. Spencer did not lose that game. A number of other people missing tackles and dropping balls cost them that day. And it was a great New Zealand side that should, and if they had got through, I'm pretty certain they would have beaten Australia that day in the final. But they didn't, and Australia won it. But I do agree with you. And Spencer has not, and Lomu in New Zealand are not remembered the way they should be because of that day.
Jonah Lomu is your number 11, and he's the only uncontested player you have in your team, which suggests that this was the easiest decision you had to make.
Absolutely. First name. I wrote 1 to 15. I said, well, who's in? I said, Lomu. I've never seen anything like him. And I don't think I ever will. He is the greatest winger. You just can't describe what it was like to coach against him. He was a colossus. You're searching for adjectives and verbs to describe what this man could do. The first time I saw him in the old days, they played curtain races before test matches. And usually it was Australian schoolboys versus New Zealand schoolboys. It would start about 1 o'clock, and then the main game would start at 3. And that was a very much an Australian tradition. We would always have 2 games on test match day. He played number 8 for New Zealand schools this day. And you just said, wow, who is this kid? He picked the ball up the base of scrum and would go 80 metres. He did it 4 or 5 times. Everyone was like, my goodness, what a number 8. About 2 weeks later, he's on the wing for Auckland. This guy is just steamrolling everyone that he comes up against. And, we saw what he did at the 95 World Cup. Poor old Mike Catt, who was a phenomenal player, happened to be the guy that got steamrolled by him. And people remember that was very unfair on Mike because he was an absolutely fine rugby player. And Jonah did it to everyone, absolutely everyone. We played them at Auckland, Eden Park in 1999. I'll never forget, I turned Strauss, the great South African captain who had emigrated to Australia, and I got back to play rugby with us. And Straussy just says, I'm going to tackle him, follow me. As soon as he gets the ball, I'm going to be the one. And Straussy was a brave guy, big dude. And sure enough, Lomu gets the ball and leading the charge of Straussy straight at him, hurls himself at him. I have this vivid memory of Tian tumbling over backwards as Jonah just goes straight through. The size of the man, the pace of him, his power, and his ability to get involved in the game. And his linking, again, as I said before, with Carlos Spencer. He was at his most dangerous when Spencer brought him in from the blind side. So people think of him on the end of a backline. But when that guy was coming in off 10 or 12, with Spencer taking the ball deep to the line, and then he's got his options. He's got a Ronnie Clark and Lou Stensis in front, or he's got Jonah Lomu or Joeli Vendiri out the back. My God, it was a nightmare, and he was phenomenal. And again, Jonah, off the field, was this quietly spoken, lovely young man.
Yeah.
Just a tragedy that we lost him so early.
100%. Your centre partnership is Tim Horan and Brian O'Driscoll. I know when we talked to Brian about his heroes, Tim Horan is definitely somebody he would name check as an inspiration in terms of being a centre. Again, just to indicate some of the players who didn't make it here: Damien Try, Felipe Contepomi, Gordon Darcy, Henry LaRue, Sterling Mortlock, Jason Little, Yannick Josian and Will Greenwood. Again, Horan and O'Driscoll, I think, is like one of the all-time great dream team partnerships.
Yeah, it tells you a bit about Australian rugby at the time too, that you could have, Horan and Jason Little, who were a great partnership, and Sterling Mortlock. Three great centres with the Australian three-quarter line now. Like, wow, it's just not even in the top 7 or 8 in the world. But we were gifted. And Timmy, he's got he's like me, he's got Irish ancestry. His family's from Tipperary. Was phenomenal over many years. So Tim, first they won the Bledisloe Cup in '89 when Tim and Jason were kids in the centres. I think they were 19 in the centres. And Tim had a horrific knee injury, came back, won a World Cup in 91, won a World Cup in 99. So, over a 12-year career with the Wallabies was staggering. I coached against Tim for New South Wales many, many times against Queensland, which is Munster versus Leinster, the blue versus the red. And the same thing, you only had to win one game each year, and that was against Queensland. If you didn't beat Queensland, you were in a lot of trouble. And they were a great side with Horan and Little and Earls. It was an unbelievably good Queensland side. And again, Tim could change a game in a split second. He revolutionised the way that inside centres play. Tim was very athletic guy, very powerful, but was not a tall guy. A bit like very, very similar to Brian in physique, probably a bit bigger than Brian in his muscularity. But Tim could accelerate so unbelievably over 15 metres and use his footwork to get to shoulders of the defenders, and then he also had a pass. But the break that Tim had was staggering. I think the other thing with Tim was he was beautifully complemented by Jason as an outside. Jason was tall and rangy, a bit like Shane Horgan, where Tim was this more compact, brilliantly fast player. I actually thought of playing Brian at 12 for a while when Brian was very young back in 99, because he reminded me so much of Timmy Horan. But Brian's ability to go on the outside was just so good that he was a natural outside centre. But it did cross my mind at the time. Okay,
Campese, you've mentioned it at 14 was somebody. For some of our younger listeners who might not be utterly familiar with Campese's range of tricks, a little bit like what you were talking about, Carlos Spencer, there was kind of a preternatural ability to understand where other people were without looking, or it was kind of a sixth sense about where they were.
Yeah, he's close to the two best players I ever coached were Brian and David, and both of them had a sixth sense. And Campo, firstly, he was magnificently fit and magnificently skilled for the amateur era. He only lasted 2 years. He was in the professional era. He won the 91 World Cup, but he was playing. He played for the Wallabies in the Grand Slam in '84 when he was only 19. David could kick the ball 70 metres both feet. He's the best punter of a ball I've ever seen in my life. He practiced. He's also the best trainer. Trained his heart out. He is electric speed. He did a goose step. He was the first person to bring the goose step in. Again, changed the game. Footwork that we now see regularly. He was the first person to do that. He literally invented it, brought it into the game of rugby. Scored tries. To give you an example, you measure how many times people touch the ball in the game. So your 9s and 10s and your 2s and your 8s touch the ball more than anyone else. You come to the end of a game and Campese would touch the ball more times than everyone on the team except for the halfback. He got involved from the wing like no one I've ever seen. He revolutionised the position. And again, until Jonah came up, he was considered the greatest player in the world, and was for many years the greatest player in the world, greatest attacking player. If you're young people, go and Google up his tries, and they stand the test of time. He is a staggering athlete.
And the last one is, sorry, were you going to?
No, I was on that last one. Like, I think Keith Wood picked Jason Robinson maybe, but that was on the wing possibly. But Matt, you've gone with Robinson mentioned there at fullback at 15, but you've got like the list of names again: Latham, Montgomery, Wilson, Poitrenaud, Gervin Dempsey, Rob Kearney, Joubert. But you've opted for an All Black as your fullback.
Christian Cullen. When Christian Cullen signed for Munster, I first heard and went, wow. That's a phenomenal signing. Christian Cullen, at his peak in New Zealand, I was coaching Super Rugby, so he was playing for Wellington, and also with Tana Umunga in that side. He was a freak. He was an absolute freak of nature. A very slight man, 83 kilos, yet he could bench press almost double his body weight. He was just this power athlete that was slight, unbelievable acceleration, great kicker of the ball, but his footwork was staggering. If you kicked to him and you didn't have a kick chase line that was absolutely disciplined and organised and brilliant in their tackling, he'd go 100 metres. There's a great clip up. It's actually against does the rounds often when Christian Cullen's name come up, of him scoring a try against the Waratahs in the Sydney Football Stadium. Now, in my defence, he takes the ball in his own try line. He goes 100. I'd ask everyone to look at the score. We were leading 45-12 at the time. And we did win the game. We did win the game, which is quite often not remembered by people when they text me, "Well, you coach when he scored that try?" And I was. But we did win the game. But that's what Cullen could do. In those days, we would tour South Africa together with the New Zealand side. So the two provincial sides from Australia, one from New Zealand, would go to South Africa, and we stay in the same hotel for 2 weeks. So you got to know these guys really well, and you got to watch them train and got to watch them as they conduct themselves. Cullen, in a generation that had Jeff Wilson and Lomu, was a staggering athlete. His star was only brief. That's the only thing I would say about Christian. When he didn't last the length of time of other players, but it was an incredibly bright star.
It's definitely one of the great sporting tragedies that he didn't get to fulfil his time at Munster and show glimpses of what he was capable of, because I know it rankers with him that people here don't think of him the way you guys do think of him, because we didn't really get to see that in person, and it kind of makes it all the more sad, really, because like that Munster team was crying out for somebody like that to be added to the mix.
Irish rugby was crying out for it, and you look what Dougie Howell did when he got there. Christian was just a staggering athlete. And I've huge respect for Dougie. Like, he's an unbelievable player, but Christian at his best was in my opinion, a step above, just slightly above Dougie. But Dougie was a legend. Christian would have been phenomenal for the game in Ireland, and it was really sad. I felt for him because he's also a really lovely bloke. He's a down to earth guy, and he wouldn't go to any team without wanting to do his best, and he certainly didn't get that opportunity, not through anyone's fault, to show what he could do.
Matt, that 15 is a match for any team in the history of the world. It is a phenomenal team that you put together. Thanks so much for doing the work for us.
Thanks for asking me. It was good fun. I really enjoyed it.
A brilliant thought experiment. The best 15 that Matt Williams coached against.